Mr. Goley seems to be denying almost that there will be a great apostasy at the end of the world. That's everyone just about admits that will happen.
And it'll be worse than the Great Western Schism when you had three claimants of the papacy. You had anti-popes in Rome. You had the whole College of Cardinals following anti-pope Clement VII.
The majority of people were supporting the false pope.
Oh, yeah, the true pope was the least supported of the three. People had no idea, says Warren Carroll. He says, no way out of this seemed possible. That's what he said about the Great Western Schism.
And also...
Okay, time has expired. Okay. That's 15 minutes. So now we'll move on to the question and answer section. 7 questions from each side with a 3-minute response and a 2-minute rebuttal. The first question from Mr. Goley.
I asked the first question?
Yes.
Okay. Since you guys didn't address it in my last point, I would like you guys to address the quote from Vatican I that St. Peter has successors in perpetuity. And if that is the case, how will you know when the next pope will be elected? How will the faithful know?
Okay, I would answer that by pointing out that I just did discuss what the meaning of Vatican I's definition on the perpetuity of the primacy and the successors in the primacy mean. So I'm not going to go over that ground again. I would point out that in the first millennium, the pope was, as he pointed out, elected by the clergy of Rome. Okay? And exactly how that occurred was not always clear at times. For instance, in the 7th century, during the Monothelite crisis, Pope St. Martin I was the true pope, and he was imprisoned, by the Monothelite emperor. And the faithful, not having access to their true pope, actually went ahead and elected Pope Eugene as their pope. But the election was actually invalid because Pope Martin I was still living. Okay, but at some point, it's still not even clear today when, Pope St. Martin I either resigned, or after his death, Pope Eugene IV somehow became the pope, because he's listed as the true pope in the line of popes. But his election had already occurred when Pope St. Martin I was living. Therefore, that election was not valid. But at some point, by his acceptance by the clergy of Rome, which is still not even clear when or exactly by what particular specific mechanism, he was considered the true pope. Okay, that proves that a recognition by the clergy of Rome, which may not be known to have specific parameters, even to this day about past elections, is certainly possible and has historical precedent for it. And that would be my answer to that question.
2-minute rebuttal, Mr. Goley.
Yeah, I don't believe he's answered the question. He cites a specific time in history where the Roman clergy recognized the Pope, and I understand that. But that was, at the time, the tradition or the rule of the Church. We have, from, I believe, at least the 13th century, and right all the way up until their own last Pope, we have Pius XII making a definitive rule in the Church that has the College of Cardinals elect the Pope. So it would take the Pope's authority to change that law, because Vatican I said that the Pope has supreme power in disciplinary matters as well. So you have, again, a time unprecedented in history where these two gentlemen, they can't even tell you how or when we're going to have a next pope. They don't know. So their position can't be correct. They can quote everything they want, I assure you. Their interpretations are not correct. They can't tell us when there will be a next pope. Their position is unprecedented in history, where not only do we not have a pope for 50 years, we don't have the electorate also. The electorate is gone. And that is the rule of the Church by their own last pope, Pius XII. He reaffirmed the conclave, changed some of the rules. That's still in effect. It would take another pope to overturn that. But the problem is they don't have one. They don't know how to get one. And they can't even tell us how we're going to know when the next pope is elected. So I guess the faithful they won't know. It's absurd. It's really absurd, and they haven't addressed it. I'm going to hold them to it. I expect in the future that they will have a better argument than that. Their argument is we simply don't know.
Okay, time is up. First question from Brother Michael and Brother Peter Diamond.
Okay, my question is this. could you please explain to us why, as you say, the ecumenical gestures made by the Vatican II anti-popes toward the schismatics, such as praising their churches, giving them relics, declaring communion with them, praying with them, signing joint declarations with them on matters of faith, giving them donations, praising their mission, etc., do not signify indeed the heresy that the schismatics are not bound to accept the primacy of the popes, as defined by Vatican I?
Well, again, we go back to this same thing that you guys have quoted throughout the debate. And again, some of these actions, I don't believe that if you said to Pope Benedict XVI or John Paul II that I don't think they would say, what we mean by this is, hey, these guys are going to go to heaven. They don't need to come over and convert to the Catholic Church. There's a whole lot of prudential decisions that these 4 or 5 popes have made that I may disagree with. But to take one quote or to take one action and say, oh, he gave them a relic or he gave them a dollar amount of money, he's a heretic, he's denying the faith, I don't think you can make that conclusion. I simply don't think you can. And based upon the fact that if your conclusion is correct, we have no bishops, we have no cardinals, we have no hierarchy. One of the reasons whenever I debate a Protestant, I always bring up the fact that for 1,500 years, nobody believed in sola scriptura. Nobody believed in justification by faith alone. So your interpretation of Scripture, Mr. Protestant, can't be correct, because if that was true, the gates of hell prevailed against the church, and there was no Christian church for 15 years. So you're going to have to argue like a Mormon argues. Well, I assert the same thing to you guys. I'm not going to sit there and necessarily explain 500 different quotes and try to figure out a way, hey, what did he mean by this when he gave this relic to the Orthodox Church? But I'm asserting that your conclusion can't be correct, because you can't even tell us how we're going to get another pope. You can't tell us, you can't cite an incident in history where not only was the see vacant, but the electors were vacant, and that directly contradicts the present law of the pope you believe is current Pius XII, the last pope. So I'm asserting that your interpretations can't be correct, just like the Protestants' interpretations of Scripture can't be correct, because the fathers of the church interpreted them Catholic, and there was no small amount for justification by faith alone and sola scriptura. Nobody believed what they did. On the Eucharist, nobody believed what they did for 1,000 years. I try not to nitpick with the Protestants on these issues, and because their conclusions can't be correct, just like your conclusion can't be correct. Because if your conclusion is correct, we have no hierarchy, we have no pope, we have no way of getting another pope. So your interpretation and your conclusions on these questions cannot be correct. Cannot be.
Okay, and the rebuttal?
I asked him if the gestures, the ecumenical gestures, signify a denial of the papal primacy, a denial of the necessity for the schismatics to accept the papal primacy. He said, no, you can't make that statement. Well, let's quote Benedict XVI, who explains exactly what these gestures mean. Immediately after denying that the Protestants and the schismatics are bound to accept papal primacy on pages 197 and 198 of his book, Principles of Catholic Theology, he makes reference to these gestures. He says, nor is it possible, on the other hand, for one to regard as the only possible form, and consequently as binding on all Christians, the form this primacy, meaning the primacy of Peter, has taken in the 19th and 20th century. So he's saying that the primacy of Peter cannot be binding on all Christians, okay, Protestant schismatics. He goes, the symbolic gestures of Pope Paul VI, and in particular his kneeling before the representative of the ecumenical patriarch, Athenagoras, referring to the schismatic patriarch, were an attempt to express precisely this. Okay, so we have his, quote, Pope admitting that these gestures, such as Paul VI's gesture to kneel before the representative of the schismatic patriarch, expressly signifies that they are not bound to accept Vatican I. How much time do I have?
About 40 seconds.